Welcome back, and continuing our look at the ever-growing list of awesome dynamics objects in XParticles, we're going to take a look at ClothFX. ClothFX was added in XP4, and as the name suggests, of course, it's for simulating cloth. So let's have a look at the workflows, let's see what tags are involved, and let's just get going on it. So I'm going to add a plane in here. This is how easy this is to work with ClothFX. This is why I really enjoy playing with it. I'm going to lift it off the ground, and then I'm going to add a collider object. Let's add a torus, get some nice looking collisions that way. I'm going to right click the torus, and we just need to add a collider tag to it, just as we would any other XParticles object. And I'm going to set our cloth up here. Now, cloth obviously relies on usually a 1 polygon thick plane object or surface, and we often need to see which side is showing through and whether it's flipped over. So what I like to do, in any cloth situation, I like to create 2 materials, one front and one back. Let's call this one front. Oops. And throw them both on the object. Now, obviously, the last tag gets evaluated in Cinema 4D, so the white one overrides the purple one. But what we can do is we can assign it to a side. So if you didn't know this before, we have this side option in the material tag, currently set to both. We're going to set the purple one to front and the grey or white one to back. And that just means that I can now see which side is the back of the cloth or underside of the cloth, and I can see the top side or front side. Excellent. Now onto the actual cloth itself. Now, we could manually create this. There are a bunch of objects you need for ClothFX to work, and especially on a parametric object like a plane, we'd need something called an XP cloth deformer. But we don't need to worry about that. If you just want to get going with the ClothFX, all you need to do is go to the XParticles object, or it's in the system object as well. I think there's a short key for this. ClothFX in the dynamics objects, and there's this button here called Create Cloth. Just click that. And immediately a bunch of objects are added to our hierarchy. And you can see we have a constraints object, gravity, an emitter, a cloth modifier, and then something's been added as a child to our plane object. And we can see it's called an XP cloth deformer. And then this is the real key object here. Between these two, the cloth modifier and the tag, I'd say they're the primary things. This is actually where we set all the cloth parameters. This is the XP cloth tag. All right, so let's just press play and see if we can... In fact, actually, before I press play, let's add a floor in, because that'll probably... Oops, added it as a child. Don't be doing that. Make it much larger. Drop that tag onto there. Just lift that one up a bit. Okay, let's go again. Press play. And you can see it starts to simulate, and we get a cloth simulation. Now, there's several things that I'm sure probably catch your eye straight away. If you've dealt with cloth in Cinema 4D before, you just slap a tag on to an object. It has to be editable, has to be a polygon mesh. This allows you to work with deformers, with parametric objects, and also it relies on the XP emitter for several reasons that are actually very good reasons. And we have this cloth modifier. Now this just has to be in the scene. If we deactivate this, we don't get any simulation in the cloth, and you can see the emitter and gravity just behave like they would normally. Now, let's go down the list and see what these objects do. So the cloth deformer, like I said, is when you're using, not just when you're using parametric objects, but it allows you to create a sort of deform the parametric object based on the cloth simulation. So that needs to be in there. And it also allows us to use fall off and things like that to activate the simulation. We'll take a look at that a bit more in detail in a bit. And then we have the XP cloth tag. Like I said, this is where we set all the parameters, how strong, how much it can crumple, how much it's going to be plastic, tearing, and all that kind of stuff, and pinning as well, which we'll look at in a bit. Constraints object, why is that in here? Well, that's providing us very, very fast collisions between the particles. Now, why do we need collisions between the particles? Don't we just need it between the objects? Well, to stop the cloth from folding over on itself, you need the particles to collide. And we're going to get onto why that's important in a bit. Gravity, obviously just a normal modifier that gets automatically added. And then the emitter itself. Now the emitter, I'm just going to step one frame along, and you can see here we have this. Oh, I need to put the cloth modifier back on. We can see that if I go to mesh wireframe, there's a particle being added to every point of our source plane. And if I go to our display and we look at the circle display, let's force that display. There we go. We can see that the radius of the particles is quite large and slightly overlapping, just very slightly overlapping. What happens if I change the size of these segments? Oh, that's for the wrong plane object. There we go. If I drop them down to 10 and then I notch along, the particles rescale themselves automatically. So regardless of the scale of the particle or the radius of the particle in here, I could set them to 0 even. They will automatically be dictated by the cloth object. And that's what this cloth modifier is doing. Okay, so that's just how the emitter works in relation to this cloth object. Let's increase our... Let's go higher. And there we go. We can see all the particles are moving, and they are then deforming the cloth using the XP cloth deformer. Fantastic. Then we have the cloth modifier. Like I said, this is just a global deactivate all cloth in the scene. If you turn this off, all the cloth will turn off. Awesome. So let's get to some of the basic ideas of what cloth is in XParticles and ClothFX. So it's particle-based cloth, and we've been dealing with constraints objects. We've been dealing with particle-to-particle collisions. We've dealt with that kind of sort of, the way that you can constrain particles physically using springs. Well, that's what is happening in this system. In fact, you could actually take a constraints object and pretty much make a cloth system yourself, which is fantastic. But the difference is the tearing systems, the way we can tear geometry, we can use parametric geometry. ClothFX just makes that all incredibly easy. And the cool thing about there's plenty of cool things about the cloth object, but you've got tearing and you can change which constraints and how they work in terms of physical cloth. So we have these 3 structure, shear, and bend constraints, or springs, if you like to think of them like that. But then also we have that combined with the particle-based dynamics. So we've talked about PBD in terms of fluids and stuff. Well, this is essentially the same idea or same principle, just in a flat surface. And what I mean by that is that these particles will help us to allow us to stop things from crumpling too much, folding over each other, intersecting. Whereas just the standard cloth object in Cinema 4D is very prone to self-collisions. It can be quite slow. And then also all the modifiers, fairly limited on the modifiers in the standard standard C4D object. In XParticles, of course, we have access to all the modifiers. So if I chuck a turbulence down, trusty old turbulence, do you know what? I'm going to start putting this into my hierarchy that I'd already created here. So let's tidy things up. And there's no issue, I've talked about this before, but if you start a scene and you just want to get going quickly, there's no problem in not having a system object in there. It just might be worth it later on adding one just to tidy things up. That's just my personal opinion. So I'm going to tidy that up, put those in there, make sure that's all in there, and let's press play. And of course, we don't want to see our emitter all the time. We might want to see our points, in which case I could just flick it into fast mode. That's probably the easiest way. And we can see we get a nice simulation here of cloth. Okay. So let's actually start pushing it a little bit more and actually get some interesting stuff. Oh, I was looking at the turbulence modifier before I got distracted. Let's turn the gravity off for a start, and let's press play. And you can see the turbulence modifier is having an effect on the cloth, but it's still being constrained by the cloth tag and cloth object, so it doesn't fold over too much. Let's exaggerate the strength of this a lot. Reduce the scale. And there we go. Now, if I reduce the strength of these constraints down, I can make this fold more and feel more like a loose cloth, but we'll deal with that in just a second. We could even use, we could use an attractor to pull it over to one side. There we go. So you can see there's so much potential here. We've got so much control over the cloth that we've got in NX Particles because it's particle-based cloth. Okay, so that's the basics of creating a cloth system. You just want to get going with it. You just add a plane object. You click the Create Cloth button, and it'll add all the stuff you need in the hierarchy, and then you're ready to go. Now, if I disable this plane here, and I actually disable the emitter that goes with it, and I add another plane object to our scene, but this time, instead of having it just parametric, I'm going to make it editable. Let's throw our materials on there, and maybe let's give it a different top material just so we can make sure we identify it as a different cloth. There we go. And now if I run the create cloth command, slight difference, we get a new emitter. We get a new emitter for the new cloth object, and then we get a tag, but instead of applying it to the deformer object, the XP cloth deformer, it applies it directly to our plane object. And if I press play, it should just carry on, and then let's put gravity on. And there we go. It behaves just like the other cloth, except this time the tag is applied directly to the plane. And the cool thing is that all the other stuff that was added automatically last time, such as the gravity and the cloth modifier, it's intelligent enough to know that they're already in the scene. You only ever need one of those each in your scene, or you can add more gravity objects, of course, but you don't want to override or add too many of them each time you create a new piece of cloth. Cool. So that's the create cloth function. I'm going to turn that, get rid of that, go back to our original cloth object here, turn them back on. There we go. Okay, I'm going to turn turbulence off. We don't need that for now. And let's take a look at some of the more basic settings in the cloth tag itself. This is where all the magic happens. Let me just hide that floor, make it a bit more clear. And go into our tag here. And we can see we've got lots of stuff in this tag that we can look at. Obviously, enable, disable, just if I disable this, the particles will just not move. And we're disabling this particular cloth. Useful if you have multiple cloths in your scene, but a basic thing, of course, in most objects in C4D. Iterations. Now, iterations is really important. Iterations is how many times per sample frame that we are going to iterate the cloth, so simulate the cloth. So it's like a subframe step. Think of it like that. I press play, and you can see it looks like this. If I decrease it to a really low value, the simulation is much, much faster, and the shape of the cloth is actually changing. Still, that's pretty stable. I'd be quite happy with that. Good speed bump. And it's worth noting that it's also linked to the X Particles subframe steps. And I've got it set to 5 actually at the moment, which is quite high. If I press play, you can see the cloth is changing its look. So you want to be very careful when you're balancing out the iterations and the subframe steps in your scene. So the default is 15, but you could probably lower that down depending on how stable the cloth is looking. And when I mean stable, I'll show you right now what that means. If I put this on end and I press play, you can see it's actually pretty stable. It's actually quite hard to break this, but we did see something happen there. So this is where having the cloth display on both, so seeing which sides are up and down, this is where this is really important. Can you see how we're intersecting itself? So that's unnatural, of course, that shouldn't be happening. And this is where the subframe steps and the iterations come into effect mostly. So if I increase the iterations, no, still getting it. And I could go to say 30. And it's a bit more stable and it's a bit more stiff in terms of its structure, but it's still not helping. So I'm going to reduce that down to, actually I'm just going to leave that at 10. Let's leave it at the default just so you can see. Then I'm going to press Command or Control D again. And I'm going to add 5 subframe steps. Press play. And now the cloth is several things. It's much, much stiffer. And it doesn't fold in over itself. And the simulation is a lot slower. So what if we want to maintain that look but get rid of those intersections? Well, this is where we need to look at the springs. So I'm going to go into these in a bit of detail in a minute. But essentially, when you increase your subframe steps or iterations, to maintain the same look that you were getting previously, you'll need to reduce the strength on these springs down. So I'm going to drop it down like that. And there we go. You can see there's no intersecting going on. The cloth still does look a little bit too stiff perhaps, so we just drop these right down. And there we go, we're back to something that was looking like before, except this time we're not intersecting everything. Awesome. This is why I love particle-based cloth. It's very, very stable, and you can throw lots and lots of cloth objects on top of each other, and they won't collapse in on each other, which is really cool. Okay, so I'm just going to reset that to default, just so that we're back to normal. I'm going to leave our subframe steps at about 3, just to keep it a bit snappy. There we go. Okay, so let's just go down the list. I won't skip anything so that it's obvious. Now, second level constraints, actually saying I won't skip something, I'm going to explain these things after I've explained these constraints, because it's a bit hard to say, a bit hard to describe without having talked about these. So let's instead take a look at the keep velocities option. Now this is, I don't use this that often, but essentially it allows you to maintain the particle velocity that is incoming into the simulation. So say if we actually click keep velocities, what this means is that it will respect the initial velocities of the particles. So if I actually have some speed on these particles, can you see there it keeps that velocity? So you can actually fire it off into a certain direction, and may or may not be useful, but say you want a particle simulator, sorry, a cloth simulation to begin as just a bunch of sporadic particles, and they kind of come back in and they bind to form a piece of cloth. Well, you'll have a bunch of other modifiers, and then perhaps the cloth deformer comes in and it enters the fall off, and then eventually it becomes cloth. Well, instead of having the cloth object immediately take over those velocities and it won't be able to play nice with other modifiers, you need to check keep velocities on. Dampening you can think of as like a drag value. Let me turn the speed off that. Let's get some weird stuff going on. Dampening is basically, you can think of it almost as drag. Can you see it? This is much slower now, much smoother. You're going to lose a lot of detail from your simulation, but you can think of that as dampening of all the velocities. So all the spring constraints, all the particle velocities. And if you're finding things are flickering and bouncing around too fast, but you don't want to increase subframe steps to improve the simulation, you can use this as a kind of as a quick fix, I would describe that as. Okay. Next up, okay, so let's have a look at our constraints and work out what is a structure, shear, and bend constraint. And I think I should get the old doodle tool out, because that's going to help us understand exactly what's going on here. And let's jump to our front view here, or right view even. And let's pull up the doodle object, or doodle paint. I'm just going to, when I drop down, yeah, that's fine. I'm just going to click draw smoothly. Make sure it's working. Lovely. And let's zoom into one of these points. So obviously we get a particle. If I nudge it along, we get a particle per frame. And let's display our particles a bit more clearly. Actually, that's probably not going to help, because there we go. Okay, so we can see we've got particles here. One there. And we've been dealing with constraints before, and all the cloth object is doing, I say all that it's doing a lot of good things, is it's using specific types of constraints that are important to cloth simulations. And those are structural constraints, shear constraints, and bending constraints. And just as I described the constraints object, a constraint is simply a spring between the particles. Okay, so what's a structural constraint? Well, structural constraint will just simply look to the particle left, right, up, and down of its position. So it'll basically say this is our hero particle. In fact, I'm just going to reduce the number of segments so this is nice, and there we go. So we've got this particle here that's our main particle. Now a structural constraint will move along these lines, and it'll hold these together like so. And each of these has its own structural constraints going out this way. So the stronger these are, the stronger it'll maintain this spacing between these particles. And overall that allows it to not reduce it doesn't collapse, basically. Even without the constraints and the collisions on, it does not allow the cloth to collapse itself. It pushes these particles away and keeps the other ones from pulling away as well. So that's structural. And just let's change the color of our doodle paint object. Now we're going to have a look at shear constraints. Now a shear constraint it's a diagonal constraint, so it'll actually move across like this. And it might also be that from each of these particles. So actually, if we're looking at this one as well, you'll get a shear constraint going across there, and so on. And what these do is this basically means that when you see this kind of constraint occurring, it prevents the object from these from pulling towards each other, but it allows them to slide. I should probably change the color again just to make sure we're not drawing constraints. This allows these, say we've got these 4 particles, and we've got shear constraints like this. Oh, go back to our yellow. Shear constraints like this. And what that means is these particles can't move towards each other, or they're kept constrained away or close to each other. So this is a sort of almost a rigid constraint. Obviously, we can change the strength of that constraint. But imagine it pushing away at this particle here and pushing this one away here. But that doesn't prevent it from shifting and shearing sideways. So this allows this, we end up, so if we have this polygon, the resulting, if we shift the points and we allow it to shear, you might have seen this in transforming in Photoshop and other packages like that. And we have, our particles are allowed to shift sideways. There we go. And the strength of these constraints, all of these constraints that we're talking about now, is how much to maintain this spacing between the constraints. So obviously the constraints in this particular scenario are from these particles. So you can imagine this as a spring, and it's pushing away. It won't let them collapse too much, but it'll allow them to slide over each other. So that's shearing. Let's have a look at our last one, which is the bend constraint. Now the bend constraint is a bit of quite a different one. So we've got our hero particle here. Well, this essentially allows you to throw springs, but skipping points. So what I mean by that is that this will constrain to this next one along. And then it'll constrain to this one along. And why is that? Well, that allows the constraint to restrict like every other particle or away from itself. And this one is allowed to move freely. And what that allows for, and if I do this in sideways, so if we actually let's, so this is our hero particle. And this is our cloth object, our cloth plane. And obviously we've got a bunch of other points all over the place, like so. Well, if we have a bend constraint that skips a particle, so it's constraining between these 2 particles, the spring. Sorry, terrible drawing, as usual. It'll restrict this particle from shifting around based on this particle, but this one, like I said, is able to move freely. And obviously, if that can go up and down, we actually end up with a bend in our cloth. So that's the simplest way I can think of describing that. In practice, I find myself just sliding the sliders around. Let's be real. When you're in production, you're not thinking about too much about the physics of things, or the very fundamental physics of things. You're still concerned about how it's going to look compared to a real world object. I think it's just useful to just get an idea of understanding of what the constraints do and how they work in terms of cloth. All right, so that's our doodling over. Let's go back to our cloth object and let's start tweaking the settings and seeing what they actually do. Okay, so let's go back to our 20 by 20 plane and press play. Just make sure everything's working. Yep, working nicely. Okay, so imagine if we turn off certain constraints. So let's turn off our shear and bend constraint, keep our structural. So it looks very, very different. And I'll tell you what I might do is I might smooth our cloth out a little bit, make it look smoother. And to do that, we can subdivide it. We could cheat and use the Fong tag, we could just make that Fong tag higher. Can you see how it's looking quite sharp there? Well, that's because these angles of this plane here are breaking that 40-degree limit. If I increase it, we can kind of fake it a bit. And that does make it look smoother. Let's hide our emitter. We don't need that in the moment. That does make it look smoother, but it's sort of a fake, and you can get all these weird artifacts. So we've got a few options. We can use the built-in X Particles cloth surface, I should call it. And that's here, and I'm going to hold Alt as I add it to the scene whilst I've got the plane selected, and that will let me do that. Now, this will let me subdivide the cloth, and then I can use this angle parameter to sort of set the sort of Fong angle and the sharpness of it. So we can keep subdividing, and you'll get a much smoother cloth. That's nice. And then we can also use these this remove stuff. We'll talk about this later. That's more about tearing. But we've also got this option to give it some thickness. So you can see there we're giving it some thickness. And if I look at it up here, we can see that's what it looks like when we're working with it there. But I have a personal preference for this. I use a combination of stuff. So you could use the cloth surface with 0 subdivisions, and we can reset the angle to 0. And then I might throw that itself into a subdivision surface. I like having separate control. Or it's alternatively, if I don't need any thickness at all, I'll just throw it directly in the subdiv surface. And for this scenario, that's what I'm going to do. I can see a few issues with that straight away. And you can see on when you put a square or a flat plane into a subdivision surface, it's going to smooth the corners out. Now, we just need to change the mode of our subdivision surface to fix this. Change it to open subdiv. And then we have these options. We have this boundary interpretation. And interpolation. And currently it's only set to edge, so these edges are kept nice and flat. But we want it to be edge and corner, and there we go, we maintain that sharp corner. I'm going to change it to isopar mode, just so we can see the original subdivision. And then we press play, and we can see it's much smoother and nicer. Okay, but can you see something happening in this cloth? If I actually turn that smooth off, and let's view it in a wireframe, although that's not showing for some reason. There we go. I think I was in a non-isopar mode. So now that I've got rid of our shear and bend constraints, can you see, of course we're allowed to bend, but we're allowed to bend way beyond the point that it's natural, and it's a bit excessive, but we're definitely seeing shearing. So you can see that shape. When you see that shape, that is shearing. And to prevent that, of course, we would turn the shear constraint back on. You can still see shearing and all of these things without those. Oh, there we go. Can you see how strong that changed the simulation? We get absolutely no shearing, but it also changes the way the simulation looks quite significantly. Oh, it's fallen off the edge of our... I think I need to add some friction to our colliders here. Awesome. There we go. Kind of staying a little bit in place now. Let's go back to our constraints. If I turn structure off completely, we're essentially going to collapse the simulation. It's not going to look very good. Just the shear constraint. And you can see that the shape of the cloth completely depletes and is no good. Let's go back to the bend constraint. So bend constraint, like I said, allows it to fold over itself, or sort of it has a resistance to bending over itself and has more control over that. So essentially it pushes back. So if we go back to our doodle object in the right view, it gives resistance to this desire for it to do this, for it to crumple like that. Back here. Very interesting, but we're getting the shearing again because I've turned the shearing constraint off. And you can see a combination of all three gives you the most structurally sound cloth. But of course, it's a bit too stiff at the moment. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to decide how we want our cloth to look. Now, my favorite kind of tweaks is to drop shear and bend quite low, leaving structural reasonably high. Or actually bring it and make sure it's high. It's usually higher than the other ones. You can go really low. There we go. And that's looking pretty cool. more natural looking cloth. Now, what's important is also the input geometry. So of course we've got, if you want more detail in your cloth, you're going to need more polygons. And obviously in this is why this is really awesome workflow. You can just use this plane and you can just double the height segments and then everything procedurally changes and you get some much, much more detailed cloth. Looking fantastic. Put our subdiv surface back on. And you can see that there. Now, what I love, I've said it many times, I love this mod, is that you can see how stable it is. There's no intersection. It's looking fantastic. A few things to note though. Now, the thickness, there's no such thing really as thickness of this cloth in terms of the simulation. It's based on the radius of those particles, the automatically set radius. So you can see here, this is where we get to some sort of, I guess you could call them limitations, but I don't think so. I think it's still fantastic. You can see that this will set the cloth offset from the surface. Of course, we could just use the surface object to expand it out, or we just increase the resolution of the cloth surface again, and it'll get closer and more accurate to the... So if I go again, press play, take much longer, but the collision is much closer to our torus. So worth checking that out, and maybe it's worth actually getting your emitters, sorry, your colliders, and having them have a negative offset so they can get much closer as well. Slower simulation, but much more detailed folding. You can see how stable that is. Oh, right up until that point. So that's where we'd need more subframe steps. And you can see that the back side of our cloth is showing through on the front. So that's a ideal moment where that is worth adding more subframe steps or iterations. And there we go. Okay, so that's a good look. I mean, how good does that look? In no time at all as well. That's what I love about these cloth sims. Okay, so this is... when I was talking about tweaking these constraints and stuff, earlier we were mentioning that I'd come back and to check out the second level constraints. Well, this actually stiffens up the cloths quite significantly. So instead of it just going from one... Oh, wow, let's go back to where we were before. And let's get our doodle object. Now, here we had this constraint going from this one particle to these next points here. Well, if you go to second level constraints or third level constraints, that allows another constraint to carry on. Really, it's actually all the way from this one, all the way on to the next particle. So this is a second level constraint. And what that means is we've got two constraints, and they're kind of overlapping each other. And that makes this cloth much more structurally strong. And in constraints, when we were looking at the constraints object, if you recall, if you increase the radius and you increase the number of connections and constraints, the stronger a connection, or the more it'll maintain its shape. So you'll have tons and tons of these second level and third level. So if we did a third level, it'd go all the way up to that one as well. Okay. And the net result of that is that the cloth is much, much stiffer. So if I do second level constraints, you can see there it almost looks like a sheet of metal almost. And we can still slide down the structural stuff, but it's going to take a lot more, or a lot lower values to actually get it to look sort of looser as cloth. So use second level and third level constraints if you want to create a sheet metal or rigid. You can see that. Do you like the... I love that you get this natural rippling and kind of stuff through these surfaces. Okay, and that comes into much more relevance when we're talking about plasticity. So that's our constraints part over. Let's look at the plasticity setting, and let's get rid of those actually for now. And that's fine. So if we look at plasticity, what's that? Well, we've dealt with plasticity in the constraints object briefly. All that means is that past a certain threshold, which is the amount that it stretches beyond its initial length. So essentially the constraint, if it gets stretched beyond a certain point, it breaks, and then it no longer becomes a spring, and it just it just keeps the particles roughly in place. How best to show this? Let's do this. Let's reset the position of our cloth, put it up here. Let's try and get the shape of this torus to actually imprint on our cloth. There we go. And then if we turn off the collider. Oh no, it's not really doing it. Let's make sure it starts much lower than that. Oops. There we go. And then if I turn that off, it should struggle. Oh no, it sort of is. Can you see how these constraints here are not pushing the cloth away from itself anymore? Well, essentially that's the idea of this plastic. In fact, let's put the second level and third level constraints on and see if it helps any. There we go. You can see here it's losing its shape a little bit here where we're breaking the shape of the mesh, shape of the cloth even. And that one looks fairly well broken. So I'm going to turn that off. So essentially, plasticity is if you want to deform the mesh permanently. So as something hits it, it can be like hitting sheet metal. And there you go. You can see that one's structurally broken. It's not going to return to its original state as a piece of cloth. And if I let that go down there, you can see actually it's maintaining its shape without the collider active even. So actually we've actually deformed it like a piece of metal or a piece of plastic, of course, plasticity. All right. Now we've got a few other things in the last part of the cloth tab. And we're going to have a look at this. So this is just basically how to control the initial movement of the cloth. Let's turn off our second level constraints. Let's get back to a nice looking cloth. There we go. Let's rotate it. When you rotate cloth on end like this in other other sort of more basic cloth simulators, you will get so much intersecting, and it won't be able to resolve without a lot of processing power. Whereas this is so stable just by using the particles. Fantastic. Okay, so let's look at the last bits on here, and that's the simulate parameter. Now simulate, all that means is when to simulate the particles or when to simulate the cloth. So we have all of these. We have all immediately. So obviously that just means that when I press play, all the particles are now cloth particles. All on collision. Now what this means is if I press play now, nothing's going to happen because there's no collision happening. But if I just bring this torus up and collide with the cloth, as soon as it comes into contact, all of the particles are activated and they are now dynamic particles. Or cloth particles. Next one down is collided points only. Now this means that wherever the torus actually hits will activate those points. Can you see there? It's only those points. And if I move it over here, you can see I'm kind of activating it by brushing past it. There we go. But the rest of the cloth, can you see how it's maintaining its position? We're going to run out of simulation time, I think. But that's quite a cool way of activating them. Let me do that and exaggerate things. I'll go faster than it can keep up with. You can see I'm actually pushing through the cloth because I'm moving too fast. When you move real time in the viewport, it's pretty good. I mean, it's working pretty well, but it's not perfect. And if I actually end up hitting all the points here, eventually it'll probably just fall down. Oh, creating some terrible looking errors. There we go. That's perfect. And you can see I've actually missed one down on that bottom corner. And I've lost my space in 3D space. But that's activating on collision. The other ones, the fall off inside and only collision, all that. Well, the only important one here is the fall off because the others are just combinations of those, of the fall off. And when it says fall off, it's talking about the fall off in the cloth deformer, which I said I'd come back to talk about. And just like the colliding, I can create a fall off object, or sorry, a fall off shape for our cloth deformer. And wherever the fall off is where our particles will become activated as cloth objects, or cloth particles. So you can see there's so much control on this. for triggering your simulations. You could even use particle activation. So you could actually use the XP particles fall off and fire particles at it, and then that would activate the simulation. Although you could also have them just collide with the existing particles, and that would do the same. All right, so that's the how to activate everything. Now down here we've got something called quad bend constraint. Now we've talked about the bend constraint before, where it jumps over different, so it skips them like that. Well, the quad bend constraint means that it combines them together, and you get a much stronger resistance to bending. It depends on what kind of look you want. And let's increase the bend resistance there. And you can see you get different looks depending. And I think they've just added that in there just to kind of stabilize certain simulations. I don't tend to use that. Almost never use that, to be honest. There we go. Let's go back to our normal simulation. Lovely. There we go. Okay, so next up we're going to take a look at... Oh, no, before I do that, I want to talk about just how the source geometry affects the look of the simulation. So obviously we've been dealing with a very simple plane object, but in reality that kind of creates some issues. And what I mean by that is that you can see this folding. It might be desirable. However, in the real world, things don't always fold up so evenly. Depending on their structure, of course. If you've got a fabric that's weaved, that is actually weaved, 90 degrees to each other, that structure is actually will actually have an influence on how it bends and folds. So, a thick weaved carpet will actually bend this way when you drop it on the floor. But say you got a piece of paper and you crumple it up, or, very like tissue paper or something like that, it doesn't fold in that same way because its structure is not as uniform as that. So what we want to do is actually want to create some sort of ununiform geometry for our source object. So I'm just going to delete all this stuff. Let's reset that. Put our plane on the floor here. And I'm going to use a little trick I like to use. Now, what I'm aiming for is something called De Lewany triangulation. I'm never good at pronouncing that one. Where we have evenly distributed triangles, and they then form quite a natural looking cloth simulation. So I'm going to drop this into, this is a little trick I use now, polygon reduction, and straight away we get something interesting looking. Now this is a sort of that triangulated mesh that I'm after. Now I can increase the amount or I can decrease it. Now I want to have a much bigger surface than that, so I could just increase the size of this surface and increase the number of divisions to start with. Let's go really high. There we go. And then we'll need to increase. Can you see that we're getting too much of an even distribution in the middle there? And even for a while after, we want to get it to the point where it starts to stop repeating the pattern. About there. Ooh, go back one actually. That was better. Oh no, I can see some even lines. There we go, that'll do. And I can current state that to object. I can get rid of our thing there. And let's activate our sim again. And I'm going to transfer, actually let's make sure our colors are different so we can see the different cloths. And I'm just going to transfer that over to this one, scale it down, and we can compare what they're going to look like. So 400 by 400. Let's turn this one off completely. Let's do a create cloth again. And we see an emitter gets added. And this is for our second one. I can deactivate that first one. Press play, and we can see it falling down. Now it looks pretty similar to what we've had before. It's not too much of a problem. So it's a bit stiffer even than the one we had previously. That's because this is all at default. So we could, if we want to just match the settings, I can just control drag that tag onto that one, and it's just replaced it. But there's an issue with doing that, and that is that the emitter associated with this tag was the other emitter. So just be wary of that and drag that emitter in there. So I just got caught out by something. So by doing that, I've actually just changed the structure of this plane. And the reason for that is that this one has stored the shape of this plane in that tag. So actually I can't do that. I should know that. And let's just press play again. Let's just match our settings. So we've got 21 and 2% in the 21 and 2%. And then everything else is default. Yes, it is. Press play. And there we go. It's looking a bit more like natural cloth. Let's play with some of the settings and let's get something a bit more akin to a piece of paper folding up. So let's reduce the structural right down. And let's actually increase the plasticity. Let's actually have it break and fold and bend. Might even get rid of our bend constraints. There we go. To allow it to crumple properly. What if we get rid of shear as well? Let's see what happens. Very cool. And if we put that in a subdiv surface, it's going to look more like naturally folding cloth. So you can imagine this is maybe an overstarched sheet at the moment. If we want it to be paper, we'd probably need to go to a much stiffer, maybe higher structural. Actually, there we go. Higher structural. Have the plasticity quite high as well. That's really cool, eh? And you'll find tweaking all these settings, you'll find your sweet spot. I'm going to reduce the plasticity down even more so we end up crumpling. And the cool thing about that is you can see that we're getting these natural folds like you would get in like a pair of jeans or fabrics, that kind of stuff. But it's not, the difference is it's not even like the other one. So if I disable that one, re-enable our other one. Oops. You can see there, that's maintaining a much smoother, less kind of crumpled look. I do need to add the plasticity into this. And there you go. You can see it has a desire to fold over itself, which absolutely might be desirable for things like silk, much more, loose fabrics, where they correct themselves, if that makes sense. So they kind of push back on themselves. So, they return to their original shape. Awesome. So triangulating the mesh is quite important, or if you want it to look a bit more natural or a different structure, that's how I do it. Now, to wrap up this initial look at ClothFX before we look at more advanced topics like the tearing and the pinning, I just want to show it with a slightly more advanced model for the collider. So let's, I'm going to actually get rid of our torus object, and I'm going to unhide something I have in this scene already. And let's get rid of one of these. Let's get rid of our non-procedural one. It just makes it a bit easier. Let's turn that off for a second. Now I've got this polar bear model, again from 3D scans. And I've done a process on it. I've processed it so it's a reduced. So if we look at the visual one, the original mesh, and this is a polar bear seemingly tickling a seal or something like that, and it's quite high res. So it's a 3D scan of a sculpture, and you can see it's very, very high res. And in fact, if I right click it and I go to object information, we can see that it's a hefty 6 million points and 2.2 million polygons. Now, as a collider, that's going to be incredibly slow. So we need to do a polygon reduction on it. And I did exactly as we did with the surface a minute ago. I dropped this into a C4D polygon reduction generator, which is fantastic, new addition. And then I output this way reduced collider. And if I show them both at the same time, you can see they kind of intersect each other. But remember, the reduced collider is never going to be seen. It's just a proximal collider. Then I've got the collider tag on it. I'm going to enable collisions. And then let's get our cloth back on. Let's bring it back up here. And what should we do? Let's go for quite a high Let's go even higher than that. I'm going to go 100 by 100. Now this is a very dense piece of cloth. It'll be a lot slower, and I might pause if it's too long. It's quick enough. I think I've got those plasticity levels still on. I'm going to turn those off. But straight away we can see how stable this is, or even without any tweaks of any settings. It's not perfect because it's intersecting with the ear there. But already you can see how beautifully detailed that can be, depending on the collider, of course. Then it hits the floor down the bottom there. Give it a few seconds and it'll start to look even more natural. There we go. And maybe we just want a prop in our scene. Maybe we just want this to be a, you know, just a fixed object. All you need to do is right click the plane, current state to object. And you can see that there is now a completely solid mesh. Well, not solid mesh, sorry. A non-animated mesh unrelated to the cloth object, apart from it being its parent. And yeah, there we go. So to improve the collisions here, we could do a few things. We could either adjust the collider to have a slightly larger collision area around here, or we just increase the subframe steps. But no, I just wanted to demonstrate some really how quick it is to get some beautifully high-end cloth in Xparticle's ClothFX. Okay, so let's jump into our next scene, which will be, or next video, which will be looking at the cloth and pinning. And there's some other stuff which is to do with connecting. That's also very cool, and we'll demonstrate that. All right, see you in the next one.